Hey everybody, Andrew Jordan again. Wanted to make a quick video in response to Dennis MacDonald, who was recently on Jacob Berman's podcast. I'm specifically referring to his claims about Jesus in the Q plus Papias hypothesis that he has devised to understand the synoptic problem and the nature of the Q document. The synoptic problem is not something I'm particularly interested in as field of inquiry, but it does come up from time to time. In his book, which I happen to have here, which is called Synopses of Epic Tragedy in the Gospels, he presents his case more fully with a fully reconstructed Q plus document, which is based off of his research into the synoptic problem, particularly paying attention to Papias and his contribution to the question. And I find his theory overall interesting. I do feel that he sometimes overstates mimetic connections between the Gospels and Greco Roman literature. However, overall, I do believe that that is a valid contribution to the field of New Testament research and something that should be taken more seriously. I also think that his theory of his reconstruction of the Q document is a bit expansive in some places where I'm not sure that that's justified. However, in working with what he was saying, I want to bring attention to a specific problem that I've noticed in his book, which I'm going to be looking at just for reference. Which his overall claim is that in the Q document, the Q plus document that he has assembled, that Jesus is presented as the new Moses, and that the book is meant to look as a new version of Deuteronomy. I think this is sounds nice, but it's hard to know um, if the book resembled the way that he's reconstructed it, which is always the problem with all Q reconstructions, in that we don't have the text itself. However, that's not the thrust of my criticism. The issue that I wanted to discuss is his conceptualization of the social identity criteria, social identity outgroup, which is part of how he's viewing each of the early Christian texts. And so, in the case of the Q plus document, he claims that the Pharisees are the outgroup from the group of the Q document. And he says that they are strict Torah enforcers. He uses that language in his book here, calling the Pharisees Torah enforcers. Um, and I wanted to pick at that language a little bit. And because he says that, I'm just looking over at the text, that the Pharisees are a stereotyped outgroups in this text, in the Q text, the Q plus text that he has assembled, and that the um, the Q the Pharisees in this case are the enforcers of Torah, and that Jesus is essentially offering a more lenient, lax version of the application of Jewish law that is for a lack of a better term, more liberal than what the Pharisees are offering. However, I think there's many things wrong with this statement. First is that Jesus, as we understand him, would not have been in any authority to interpret or enforce Jewish law uh, because he was not a member of the Sanhedrin or the temple complex. And the Sanhedrin would have been in charge of enforcing Jewish law. Not even Pharisees were in charge of enforcing Jewish law in that period. The Pharisees were a group of that held legal opinions, but was not as such involved with enforcing Jewish law unless they were involved with the Sanhedrin, which they often were. Those Pharisees seem to have been a group of Jews that were committed to scrupulous observance of tithing and ritual purity regulations. There is a process of initiation that's described in the Tosefta Mishnah, in which a person joins as a chaver, a friend or a member of the group, and has an initiation period in which they prove their willingness to follow these issues more closely. And one of those would have been table fellowship, ensuring the ritual of purity of all food and clothing and other items like that. So that is what the Pharisees were. Their legal opinions were valued and treasured by the people, as mentioned by Josephus, because they were the liberal, lax lenient party of interpreting Jewish law. The Sadducees, who were the group associated with the aristocratic priesthood in Jerusalem, held a much stricter interpretation of Jewish law, as did the Essenes, the separatist version of the Zadokites from the same region, same origin as the Sadducees. So the characterization of the Pharisees as Torah enforcers, I think, is inaccurate and relies too much on um, Protestant kind of thinking. Um, in the second case, the I'm just refreshing my memory from the text over here that and within the Pharisees themselves, there are two subgroups. If we take rabbinic characterizations of the Pharisaic period as accurate, which most scholars take to some degree, with questions along the way, but there were two major subgroups of Pharisaic opinion, and Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beit meaning house of or school of, two legal schools essentially. Beit Hillel took is often characterized as taking the more lenient approach, and Beit Shammai the more stringent approach. That's not necessarily always the case, but in a broad sense, that's generally true. So I wanted to look here at the some of the Q plus material that Dennis MacDonald refers to. In general, in most constructions of reconstructions of Q, there's no halakhic legal material at all. And even in the full gospel literature, there's very little that can be considered halakhic, meaning related to Jewish legal discourse. Jesus does not seem to be interested in halakha because the context of the composition of the gospels is post-dating um, Christian engagement with Jewish law, in my opinion. So the texts from 70 onwards are written in time periods where Christian, Jewish Jesus believers in general and Jewish Jesus believers are outside of the um, scope of influence of halacha. So there's no engagement with the process. However, in the few places where there is engagement with some topics of halacha, which include Jesus's discussion of Shabbat, of divorce, and oaths, are probably three of the cases where you could argue that there's some halachic discourse happening. In the case of divorce, Jesus is actually much more stringent than the Pharisees, in that he permits. No, he does not allow divorce at all, whereas the Pharisees under Beit Hillel do allow divorce for nearly every case that you could want to be divorced for. It would be allowed only and so that's the common rabbinic idea today and was in the Pharisees as well. So in that case, Jesus is actually stricter than the Pharisees, which would not fit within the paradigm that he's offered. So one of the texts that is mentioned here is the issue of gleaning on Shabbat, which is a famous pericope in most of the gospel traditions. Um, and this is the case when Jesus and his disciples began plucking the grain and eating it. And so, what this relates to is an interpretation of the laws of Shabbat, which are 39 categories of actions that are prohibited on Shabbat, and this includes picking food, grains, or anything from a plant. You're not allowed to remove things from plants during Shabbat to eat them. If something falls on the ground on its own, you're allowed to pick it up and eat it, but you're not allowed to take something from a tree or a plant or anything like that and eat it yourself. So in the text itself, I'll read from Dennis MacDonald's Q plus reconstruction. It so happened that he was traveling through the grain fields on a Sabbath, and his disciples were gleaning the heads of grain and eating them. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, what are they doing what is not permitted on the Sabbath?" But he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and those with him were hungry? How he went into the house of God, took the bread of the presence, ate it, and gave it to those who were with him, bread that is not permitted to eat except for the priests alone. And he said to them, The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Now, there's different notes here about how. to reconstruct the text, but I just want the general idea. And so this is a basic argument for pikuach nefesh, which means which is a concept of overriding the laws of the Sabbath in order to save a life. That's essentially the concept that's being debated, and Jesus is saying that his disciples are in danger of death if they do not eat um, on the Sabbath. However, from the context, there's really no indication that this is to be interpreted as the case. The immediate context before that are is a pericope that is where Jesus and his disciples are asked why they are not fasting, presuming that they're eating. So the context does not lend to a pikuach nefesh interpretation of the permissibility of the action of eating the grains or not. So um, while this is a halakhic discourse, the rabbis, in this case represented by the Pharisees, which might be a contemporary presentation of some sort of debate between Christians and Jewish leaders in some way. Um, the story reads that there's an episode where Jesus is not fasting, and then in the next episode he's saying that his disciples are too hungry and need to break the Sabbath in order to survive. And he relies on a story from the Hebrew Bible that is meant to support the claim, but is not necessarily a strong claim. Um, but in any case, the um, the the text, the way that Dennis is interpreting it, is to say that Jesus is lax and lenient, and the Pharisees are strict and Torah enforcers, and that's inaccurate here. And in this case, they're really just asking a simple question: why is he doing what is prohibited on the Sabbath? And his answer is to apply to a pikuach nefesh reasoning of the action. However, they don't accept it. In regard to other instances in the Gospels where there is this kind of debate, the other case would be healing on Shabbat, which is the issue between Jesus and the Pharisees is the manner in which he heals, not necessarily the action of healing itself on Shabbat. The actions that Jesus uses to heal are prohibited according to Jewish law. Um, and we're assuming that the Pharisees' law resembled in some way rabbinic law, but might have been different. Anyway, that was just a short thought about the issue of Jesus and the Pharisees.